Hello, it's Ben Hawkins here, the CEO of the Air Conditioning Mechanical Contractors Association, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Alex McKellar and Natasha Joukhdar from HFW Law Firm today to talk to us a little bit about what's going on in the world with respect to price escalation, supply chain disruption, and how all of that gets folded into contract conditions and the impact on commercial businesses. So, Alex and Natasha, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. Before we sort of launch into any deep questions, maybe Alex, you can give us a little bit of an understanding about your role at HFW, your experience with the construction industry, and obviously we've actually known each other for quite a long time. So maybe some history on your involvement with the AMCA and its members.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ben. It's good morning to you, and great to connect again. Uh, I'm a partner at HFW, a lifelong construction lawyer, having practiced in that area only for more than 25 years. I'm the head of the construction group at HFW, which has 8 construction partners across the country. Natasha Joukhdar is a senior associate in the team, and also a lifelong construction lawyer. In terms of AMCA, I started my career in the AMCA building in Cromwell Street, Burwood, for those of in the industry that have been around a little while and have looked after mechanical contractors amongst many other participants in the industry for the whole of my career. So a reasonable degree of familiarity with the mechanical services space, and Natasha's learned from some of that experience in addition to her own work for specialist subcontractors, including those in the mechanical industry.
Thanks so much, Alex. Natasha, obviously you've been in the industry for quite a while as well, but do you sort of want to share some of your experiences as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Alex covered it well, but I'll just briefly touch on it. I've been a construction lawyer for 10 plus years now. I have worked with HFW for close to 6 years. A range of my experience delves in HVAC contractors as well as other sort of subcontractors and major contractors, but in particular we do plenty of work for specialist contractors and mechanical contractors and electrical contractors, and just a range of both front and back end work in relation to those contractors. So I've had plenty of experience, and now working with Alex, who is a specialist in this area, he's taken me under his wing a little bit as well and shown me the ropes a bit more, and he's got all the background knowledge to these contractors, and it's been a really good journey.
Yeah, Alex has been very generous with me over the years with his time as well. So I know where you're coming from there. Before we sort of dive deep into construction law and in particular contract law too much, probably just a bit of setting the scene. When we first spoke, Alex, about teeing this up, it was very much on the back of conversations that I was having with our members around cost escalation and the way that they were thinking about tendering for projects into the future, a very uncertain environment with respect to costs, and that's coming off, several years of inflation. Um, Alex, can you sort of tell us a little bit about what you're hearing in the marketplace at the moment? Because I know you work with a whole range of members of the supply chain, from specialist contractors to manufacturers, suppliers, head contractors. So, what are you hearing at the moment?
It's just before we sort of deal with the current day situation, I think it's just worth casting our minds back and in time a little bit. The market conditions, if you look back over the last 25 years, have more recently been quite volatile. But prior to that, there was a very long period of stability, both in national politics and international politics, which meant that prices were stable. There was occasional price spikes. We've had a couple of copper price increases. We had the GFC, but really since the COVID pandemic, there have been a series of pretty volatile market conditions which have impacted upon pricing we've had significant supply disruptions, including the closure of the Panama Canal for a period of time, which had a pretty significant impact on shipping. The COVID pandemic was a major disruptor, both in terms of pricing and freight and logistics. And the most recent shock is fairly obviously the war between Iran and the US, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and the price volatility that's accompanied that, both in terms of freight costs with diesel in particular and plastics, which is probably less relevant for the mechanical industry than others, including the plumbers. But it's had a very significant impact, and so has the freight cost and logistics disruption that's been thrown up by the recent conflict.
Thanks, Alex. Natasha, have you got anything to add there? You would be
Yeah.
fairly client-facing, I imagine. What are you hearing at the moment?
Absolutely. I mean, it's just the practical effects of what Alex has just explained is that we're seeing a price increase in relation to the materials that Alex mentioned. There's a reduced willingness to actually to engage. A lot of these contractors are holding stock or locking in the pricing because they're concerned that obviously these the volatile nature of the market at the moment will impact them negatively. And there are a range of suppliers that are actually withdrawing or shortening their price validity because they don't know what the future looks like. They don't know what the price will be in a certain amount of time, given the volatility that we're experiencing at the moment. So it's just creating hesitation all around, and it's debilitating the market in that respect. But it is something that we have obviously experienced before, as Alex mentioned, during the COVID pandemic. And hopefully, if these contractors learnt from the COVID pandemic, they would have suitable clauses to deal with these situations. But generally, it's creating a lot of reluctance.
Thanks, Natasha. I guess sort of in preparing for today, we had some discussions around how to frame things up. And Alex, you sent through a bit of a framework in terms of dealing with pre-contract and post-contract. Maybe before we progress any further, you can sort of just tell us a little bit about, that framework that you use and how you think it can inform our members and other specialist contractors in thinking about the way they approach these issues.
Well, there's obviously two sort of fairly critical periods. One is in the lead up to entry into a contract, and managing that process and potentially including mechanisms which cover off some of the price volatility, as well as doing things in a commercial way, which is going to be palatable and solve the similar problems the upstream parties, the main contractors are having similar problems. And to the extent that subcontractors can enter into a sort of problem-solving mindset rather than a complete risk mitigation mindset, I think that's the first sort of step. The second is if you do have locked-in pricing and you're experiencing price volatility, we've seen a couple of instances where suppliers, particularly international suppliers, have just refused to perform on contracts. And although there are legal remedies for that, you can, potentially sue for damages for breaching a supply contract. It's not particularly good for long-term business, particularly if you rely on those suppliers to continue to supply key materials which are critical for that industry. Don't think we've seen a lot of that in the mechanical services space at this point in time, and hopefully we won't. But in other industries, there's certainly been some effectively refusal to comply with long-term pricing arrangements because of market volatility.
Yeah, look, you've picked up on something that, we hear a lot in the construction industry, and that's the importance of relationships. And I guess when it comes to these sorts of issues, sometimes you hope those relationships mean something. But oftentimes we also hear that the relationship will be drawn upon at a stage in the future. Look, if you can help us out now, we'll help you out down the line. But obviously, under circumstances where price volatility is so acute and putting so many businesses under pressure, it's little solace to be worrying too much about what the relationship's going to give you in the future. Can you tell us a little bit about, the advice that you give clients around how to manage that relationship, how to be proactive? And Natasha, I could see you nodding. Can you sort of tell us a little bit about what your attitude is to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of maintaining the relationship, I think approaching everything with a degree of reasonability is important. A lot of the times there are mechanisms under the contract which that various contractors can enliven if they wanted to. But in terms of any unpaid invoices, if they wanted to go down the SOFA route, for example, but that obviously will lead to hostility and difficulty between maintaining the relationship with various principals, etc. So, you need to approach things with a degree of sensitivity, and also just open dialogue, but ensure that you are aware of all of the various rights of recovery in the contract or under the contract, and making sure that you are aware of the risk that you hold before you enter into these conversations and you have these discussions. Because if you are exposed in one or more ways, you'll want to know that exposure before trying to reach a resolution and trying to come to an agreement. And obviously play on your strengths, but ensure that you are having these commercial negotiations and aren't getting too stuck in the weeds and the detail of things. Alex, did I cover that? Did I cover it, or is there anything else that you think that I should have added to that?
I think that's broadly right. I think approaching the conversations with clarity around your position, both your risks and opportunities, and with a degree of honesty and openness, in our experience, tends to be the best approach. That might not always be the case, and you've got to adapt your approach to the situation. But broadly speaking, I think they're very sensible lessons.
Have you got some examples where you've seen that work in practice? Where you've got two parties who, recognise the challenge that's in front of them, recognise that it presents a risk both to each of their businesses independently, but obviously to the project as a whole. And are there any lessons that we can draw from that, or does it really come down to the particular circumstance and the particular personalities?
I think ultimately construction is very much a personality driven industry. So it does come down to personalities to some extent. But I think there are sort of sensible lessons you can take away. And right at the beginning, we talked about seeking to approach things with a degree of commerciality and a commercial mindset. And I think one sort of recent example I can think of was there was a particular product specified, and the supplier wouldn't lock in pricing for any extended term for that product, and as a consequence, the subcontractor reached an agreement effectively to cap the potential price rise of the product. So the actual cost was going to be open booked, but there was a cap on the escalation, which meant the upstream party could sort of limit their exposure to the price of that particular product. There was some shared risk there, so the subcontractor was paid more if the cost went up to a particular limit, and there was a sensible agreement about what that limit was. So the downside sort of risk exposure for the subcontractor was reasonably limited, but also meant that the risk was priced into the main contractor's price, and that was a satisfactory solution for both parties.
When we're thinking about pre-contract, we're thinking about pricing, clauses, tendering strategy. We've just spoken a little bit about relationships, but at a practical level, Can you talk us through the sorts of things that you'd be advising clients in this sort of environment where they're heading into a contract or into a tendering process, the things that they should be thinking about?
I would be advising my clients to pay close attention to various clauses in the contract, especially when tendering for a project. For example, price escalation clauses, just generally variations and related condition clauses, delay and extension of time clauses and entitlements, force majeure clauses, especially in terms of what we're seeing now with the war, notice requirements and sort of strict time bars. And, many entitlements are lost, not necessarily because they don't exist, but because they weren't claimed correctly, and just making sure that you are aware of what is actually required of you before you enter into the contract. A lot of the times you see contract clauses that are drafted in such a way that the entitlement exists, but for example, the actual compliance requirements are to such a high degree that it's really difficult for contractors practically to obviously comply with those requirements. For example, you see variation proposals that are required within 1 business day or 2 business days, and they're extensive. They require an estimate of the cost, what's involved, the impact on the program, and realistically, it's just not. It's not practical when you're actually dealing with larger projects and when there are various moving parts and you need to take into account, the various flow-on impacts of such a variation. So, I would say make sure that the contract clauses and the notice requirements and all the various preconditions that need to be met are reasonable and are achievable from a practical perspective.
Alex, any thoughts on that? Absolutely agree with that. I think before there's some other things that you can do as well as being aware of the contractual entitlements when tendering. And I would say the sort of first line of defence is your tender validity period. If you're pricing in a period of significant price volatility, you want to ensure that your tender validity period or your price validity period is quite limited. You can carve things out of your price, so there are elements you can price with certainty now, and there are elements that you that might be subject to significant fluctuation or movements, which you could carve out through mechanisms like a provisional sum or a prime cost allowance, or probably more likely simply expressing in clear terms in the tender response that a particular element is subject to fluctuation and will be priced once the job's finally awarded. My experience is very few of the AMCA fraternity involved in what I call hard tendering, which is place the envelope in the box by 4 p.m. on a given day, which is sort of more typical for government type contracts. And they tend to be much more in the rough and tumble of the commercial industry, where they're tendering to head contractors, not exclusively, but sort of more, particularly for the larger projects. I think it's more of that type of tender, which gives you a fair bit of flexibility in the nature of the response, the tender response you can give, and so ensuring that there is clear expression in the tender that the price of certain components might vary, and perhaps even giving an explanation as to why and what factors are relevant to the pricing, because that seems to potentially make those type of exclusions a lot more palatable, particularly when head contractors want a hard money tender.
What about where projects are subject to quite long delays? So, the project gets awarded, but then gets delayed for circumstances beyond the specialist contractor's control. Obviously, that puts at risk the price, even under the circumstances where they may have, ticked all of those boxes. Can you talk a little bit about that? And if there's not much wiggle room, are there any other sort of practical strategies that they could use to try and maintain that risk?
That is an excellent question, and often something we've encountered in several times in the past, where a contract commences and then there is an extended delay, And there's several recent examples I can think of where precisely that has occurred. One of the things is to include a term in the contract which effectively has a variation or price adjustment mechanism if the work commences at a time well after when you expect to be either commencing the work or probably more relevantly doing the ordering. The other possibility is ordering at the commencement and then storing the equipment. That has some obvious problems in the mechanical space because warranties and the like from the manufacturers tend to run from the delivery date, not the installation date. So that can be tricky. But if there's something which is highly volatile in price and doesn't have the warranty problems associated with it, you can potentially order early, lock the pricing in, and make sure that you've got the storage sort of component covered. But that's sort of harks back to that, finding different commercial strategies to try and limit price movement or risk in price movement. And so that's a couple of possibilities. I think there are probably others too.
So the price certainty period, is that where it's sort of linked more to the start date as opposed to the sign date, is it?
Yes. And I can think of specific examples where we have built clauses into contracts which say if materials are ordered by X date, then the price will be a particular number. And if it's ordered after X date, there'll be a price adjustment mechanism which varies the price of a particular component of the works.
Is that something that is used, fairly frequently, or is it something that's quite new? Are there ways or there are types of projects where you've seen that be more prevalent than others? I'm sort of just thinking about feedback that we get, and we'll sort of probably get to rise and fall clauses later, but where these mechanisms exist in theory but not so much in practice.
They certainly exist in practice because there are plenty of contracts out there, for example, long-term maintenance contracts. The contracts for the maintenance of the, say, Sydney Metro system for the main components are 25-year contracts. Similarly with a BESS project, a battery project, you'll often have a 20-year warranty period on the performance of the battery cells. So it's far less prevalent in the sort of mainstream contracting space, but in operation and maintenance and in those sort of longer term arrangements, it's very common to have price adjustment mechanisms.
Natasha, what have you sort of seen in that space? Have you sort of seen any particular strategies that work better than others in trying to get those inserted into contracts or get tender processes to be a little bit more accommodating for those sorts of things?
Yeah, it just ultimately it depends on who you are actually contracting with. I think you tend to there are certain players in the game, and I'm thinking of one in particular that are very steadfast in their position and don't necessarily accommodate. So I think you need to know the player before you actually start engaging with them and entering into certain projects, especially in the battery space where there are really large players involved, for example. Um, and they hold all the cards, so you might not necessarily have the opportunity and the ability to ask for much movement in their contracts. And typically what we see in a practical sense and what we do is if, for example, you enter into a particular subcontract arrangement where the terms are quite stringent, you would agree with the principal to flow up those the risk essentially to the principal because they're obviously aware that you don't have any bargaining power downwards down the supply chain. So you essentially try and negotiate a position upstream and ensure that you are protected as best as possible. So, know your player, but also if you are forced to enter into a particularly difficult contract, ensure that you are able to mitigate that risk elsewhere. So, for example, upstream, and ensure that you preserve that entitlement. And you might have for sort of back to back entitlement with the particular principle involved, and ensure that you are protected in that respect.
Yeah, it's sort of something I mentioned before that we recently participated in a survey or sent a survey out to our members along with other specialist contractor association members. And it was contract variation support that came up as one of the key needs. One of the things that we're looking for, even more than regulatory relief, a little bit behind tax relief. But it just goes to show that it's an area that, companies really feel like need support. Um, I think sometimes it's probably something that's more available than they realize. Can you sort of talk about, how what that process actually looks like for those who, maybe aren't super familiar with seeking that support before they enter into a contract?
Natasha, do you want to start the
Sure.
answer to that one?
So Ben, when you say support, you're saying, how do these entities actually receive support in terms of what exactly? Negotiating a more positive position for themselves? I mean, just so I understand what you're really.
Yeah, that's what I mean. So, they may be participating in a tender, they may even be the preferred winner, but there's some things in there that don't sit super comfortably. They know that the risk is fairly high, but I guess specialist contractors always sort of feel a little bit like the negotiating power doesn't necessarily sit with them
Yep.
as much as they would like. So just getting some support around how to go about that. Maybe sometimes giving something to get something is the things that you can sort of suggest, but
Yeah.
also in terms of the way that they go about getting that support, keeping the scope fairly narrow so that the cost is contained, but still making sure that they're getting the advice they need.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think there are a couple of things. One is, like I mentioned, ensuring that you can mitigate your risk elsewhere. So, if, for example, you don't have the support with, one of the subcontractors that you're dealing with, you can either mitigate your risk upstream. That's one of the ways you can do it. But I think as well, like you said, giving and taking. If, for example, when you are tendering, you're in a particularly difficult negotiation, and you don't have another party who's willing to meet you halfway, know what sort of risk you are willing to accept, and practically whether or not you can actually adhere to the terms of the contract, and then pressing for the more stringent sort of clauses that you wish to press for. So, for example, if you know that you are particularly exposed in one particular area because of the nature of the work that you're involved in or your past experiences on projects, you can ensure that you maintain your position in relation to those clauses, but then show your reasonableness and protect yourself by giving in or allowing them to take something that's not as important for your particular area and in your particular field. So I think a bit of give and take, I would say, is pretty important in the negotiation space and during the tendering process, and ensuring that you are appearing reasonable so that the other side would likely meet you halfway.
Alex?
I think there's a couple of elements to ensuring that you have your best opportunity to recover costs when you incur them. The first is the notice requirements of the contract and the formal requirements. Typically, the contracts include reasonably onerous notice requirements and demand that notices be given in relatively short timeframes after direction is given or events occur. So having on hand a ready-made guide, if you like, it can either be in the form of a manual. Some contractors have contract administration guides which are available to them with draft forms in, for example, to assist their project teams in making sure they comply with the notice requirements. So I think that's one element which is of significant. The second is, how do you go about pricing or get into the sort of heart of the cost escalation without disclosing all of your internal margins and the like. So, a typical way you might do pricing for a variation is you say, well, the supply cost has increased. Here is the supplier's initial price and here is the supplier's new price. That has some fairly obvious problems in that you give away details of the supplier and the precise costing to the contractor, and many contractors are reluctant to do that because it enables the upstream party to get sort of inside information, if you like, about the contractor's pricing mechanism. So in those circumstances, what you typically want to do is look to an index or some other independent sort of pricing formulation, which you can use as a proxy for the price increases that you're expecting. With currency, it's relatively easy. You've got the foreign exchange rates, which are readily published, but in other areas, copper escalation, for example, you need to be able to identify a reliable and sensible index. And mechanicals particularly difficult because the equipment is typically made up of a whole mix of different metals. It's not like cabling, for example, for the electricians, which is primarily the price is primarily copper driven. There's a lot of elements in the makeup of the key pieces of equipment. So picking a suitable index and potentially having a proportionate impact on the pricing is relevant. So a chiller, for example, will have particular components, primarily steel and other elements, which make up the chiller. And so picking an index which is relevant to the pricing of the chillers will be important to be able to demonstrate cost escalation. And you usually want to do that in advance.
Yeah, look, I was going to raise a question around indexation when we got to rise and fall clauses. You mentioned, obviously, in the area of HVAC and mechanical services that it can be a little bit difficult. Are there particular indexes that you would recommend?
It's difficult to say to identify a specific index, and for certain materials, there are well-recognised indexes. Copper is one. There's the London Metal Exchange Copper Index, which is a useful guide for copper. There are similar indices for timber, steel, lithium carbonate if you're into pricing batteries, and numerous others. But picking specific ones relevant to mechanical services is a bit difficult, and I suspect the major players in the industry will actually have a much better idea about the drivers of price change than the lawyers will.
Have you seen that head contractors are open to those sorts of discussions if you have them before the contract and you give both parties an opportunity to wrap their head around what that means?
Yes, we've seen lots of instances where head contractors are willing to have the discussion. Some are more willing than others, which will come as no surprise to anybody who's been in the industry for a while. I mean, essentially, I think there's an element of selling this as well. That what you're actually doing is solving problems for them. So if the subcontractor is forced to completely fix their price, then they're going to, unless they're not going to be in the industry for a long time, have to price in an element of risk, particularly when there's market volatility and prices are typically only going in one direction, which is up. The contractor, the upstream contractor, the head contractor wants the best possible price for the project to put itself in the best possible position to win the tender, but doesn't want to expose itself to unpriced risk either. So if you can offer the head contractor a solution to minimising risk, which it can then sell to its client, and particularly with a cap on the sort of upper limit of what that might look like, then that we found that tends to be a lot more palatable than simply saying we want a cost escalation provision, which means that all of the upside cost risk belongs to the head contract.
Yeah, is there an element of early contractor involvement in all this as well? If you're part of the conversation much earlier, it's a more collaborative approach to contracting. There's a lot more transparency. I guess that sort of lends itself to that sort of approach a little bit more. Obviously, it's not always projects aren't always tendered in that way, but do you find that early contractor involvement tends to lend itself to those sorts of mechanisms more?
Yes, you get to put options on the table, including early delivery, for example. Does the site have a sufficient laydown area to enable us to deliver materials ahead of time? If it doesn't, then what's the balance between the cost of warehousing and the cost of the potential cost risk of later delivery or later ordering? If foreign exchange is going to play a significant role, particularly if it's a long-term project, what's the cost of hedging? And is that a viable solution to cap, foreign exchange risk? Having those discussions before it gets to the sort of pressure cooker environment where the work started and the contract needs to be signed means there's just much more scope for sensible discussion.
I'm always conscious when we're having conversations like this, particularly if we're sort of talking about foreign exchange hedging and things of that nature, that they're probably things that are more realistic, at the very sort of tip of the industry. But obviously, as we know, the bulk of contractors working in construction are small and medium enterprises where those sorts of things aren't available. I know it's a bit of a tricky question, but are there mechanisms that you find to be more accessible and more realistic, but also effective for those companies that are at the smaller end of the market, but still doing construction work?
I think it's much more around the tender validity and ordering window type provisions with a sensible mechanism for cost adjustment, which is easily understood and easily calculated and enforced. The other element, I suppose, at that end of the market is the scope for ordering early, for delivering materials or storing materials is probably higher because the volumes and quantities are lower. And that's, it's pretty difficult for duct, but for equipment, you can often find solutions, including early purchase, where the supplier will take an order but hold the delivery of the order for a period of time. So if the supplier can obtain factory pricing for a particular window, then that's something the mechanical services contractor can take advantage of and lock in pricing.
Have you got any thoughts on that, Natasha?
Yeah, and no, not necessarily. I mean, there are, Alex has said, obviously, depending on what type of equipment and things like that you can order and the lead times involved, and obviously just how volatile the particular market is for that particular item, you should be taking into account. But I mean, there are obviously a range of other things that I think come into play as well in terms of availability and in ways in which it can be stored. Also the risk that you adopt when you do obtain the material and you are storing it, and if the title in the goods vests in a particular contractor upon its delivery or upon payment, and you adopt that risk. If something goes wrong with the storing of that particular equipment, then you're obviously exposing yourself to loss in that respect. So there are a range of various factors that you need to take into account when you are thinking about how to obviously avoid any price escalation when you are dealing with ordering materials early on. But the way what Alex has said is essentially the best possible way you can actually try to mitigate that risk, and obviously try and control it as much as you possibly can when you are dealing with such a volatile environment as well. But I think that if you do have clauses in the contract that try, in particular, rise and fall escalation clauses that deal with these situations, then you are obviously less exposed to that risk, and that's probably the best way to protect yourself as a contractor.
Yeah, great. Look, I think just to drill a little bit further into rise and fall, and maybe also force majeure, because they're the two things that you quite often hear when inflation and cost escalation is as intense as it is at the moment. It's certainly something that we heard a lot about during COVID. So maybe just taking them one at a time, rise and fall. Obviously, you need to have it in the contract to begin with, and we spent a bit of time talking around pre-contract strategies and conversations that you should be having proactively. But I think also because rise and fall historically has probably been reasonably rare, there might also not be a great level of understanding out there around how they actually work in practice. So it might be worthwhile just drilling into that a little bit. Can you shed some light around once you've got a rise and fall clause in your contract, how that actually works in practice?
Perhaps I'll start this off because the AMCA did have, going back into back in history, a rise and fall mechanism which was based on a pricing index run by the run by the AMCA. And Ben, I don't know if is there still a price index which AMCA retains?
No, not at the moment, Alex, but that's something that we're supposed to be talking about. I think we've spoken about revisiting some of those things from years gone by, and updating them for the present.
Yeah. So effectively what that did was had a sort of pricing benchmark, similar to what the metals exchanges and foreign currency and all the rest of it use. You've got a benchmark which you compare the before and after number to and recalculate on that basis. I suspect the days of going back to something like that are probably unlikely, because an industry association, which obviously has its members' best interests at heart, is possibly not seen as the most sort of independent voice in terms of determining what the appropriate pricing mechanisms are. What I think we have seen, which is successful, is not cost escalation across the whole contract price, but cost escalation contained to particular elements of the contract price. And whether that's the materials ordering or even a subcomponent of the materials, you have a specific cost escalation provision about a part of the contract price, which is tied to a well-known index. And I think there's been a reasonable degree of success with those type of provisions. The other, in the longer term projects, and particularly long-term maintenance projects, and especially those done under the EBA regime, there are labour cost escalation provisions as well, which are pretty well known in the industry. And as a recent example, we've been assisting a client that's pricing a project which runs to sort of 2033. And I'm reliably told that the cost of an A-grade electrician in 2033 at the current EBA rates doing sort of 2 or 3 hours of overtime a week will be about $300,000 a year. So predicting the balance of labour over the course of a project of that duration and allocating the labour hours to particular years for pricing purposes is pretty challenging. So it's possible to build in mechanisms, particularly on those larger projects, which allocate hours to particular time periods and then tie the costs to the EBA rates for the particular time periods. And it's the same thing on maintenance contracts. Those long-term maintenance contracts I mentioned earlier are tied to particular labour benchmarks, given the fact that you simply can't predict what labour prices are going to be in 25 years' time.
And I think if you use a clear escalation mechanism in the contract and you clearly define, for example, what the base price is, or the index at purchase or delivery and the index at the base date, then you'll be able to really consistently calculate the adjusted price using a reliable method. And if you tie that in with the specific materials, like you mentioned, Alex, or the labour, then you are in the best possible position to protect yourself from those price increases using a very clearly defined method within the contract. And that's what's important to keep in mind.
So I think if I'm understanding correctly, like the key parts there are obviously you need to have those mechanisms built into the contract to begin with, and then having some sort of index that is acceptable and transparent, and then presumably there's review gates as well, or review periods where you're marking to market, if you like, and then going back to your contractor and saying, look, this is the difference in price, and so this is the impact that it's going to have on our claims going forward. Does that sound like a fair summary of the sort of the key pillars of that process?
That's generally right. For the smaller contractors who you mentioned earlier, I think it is often less of a concern if you're transparent about the supplier pricing part of it, particularly if you're only giving limited information about a portion of the supplier pricing. So if your costs are one particular element of your subcontract price is particularly volatile, then being transparent about the third-party supplier pricing that you're getting and being able to demonstrate direct changes in that is another way of demonstrating price increases, which is can be reasonably hard to argue with.
And it sort of, I guess, brings us back to a point that I think you made a little bit earlier, Natasha, around contract administration, or what I took to be contract administration. There may be mechanisms within the contract that provide you with certain rights, but it's your ability to give effect to those rights by following processes and issuing notices on time and the like that are really critical. And then I think the point that you were making back then too was that understanding what those processes or what those requirements actually are, so it might be easy to sort of see what the right is, but you've also got to think through what's required in order to give effect to that right. Does that apply in these circumstances as well?
I would say absolutely. And this is why it's really important to have someone who really understands the contract. And it is really important when you are engaging in the tender process that the commercial people that are actually going to be administering the contract are heavily involved in its review and understand the terms. Because ultimately the lawyers, I mean, us on the call, we can dictate various things, but in reality, we're not going to be the ones on site and actually administering these clauses in a practical sense. So we very much need the commercial managers and the commercial representatives to be just as, if not more, involved than the lawyers in the negotiation process. And it is essential because they actually also can think of very practical solutions, whereas lawyers may tend to I wouldn't say overcomplicate things, but we obviously have a very different way of thinking about things than what engineers and various commercial managers and whoever else is. So, even in terms of a price escalation clause, there might be another more practical solution. For example, having alternative products that you can tap into. If, for example, a certain product reaches a particular amount or it exceeds the original baseline price by X percentage, then there should be maybe a more practical solution. Turn to an alternative, more affordable product that actually still meets the various requirements under the contract and would still give effect to the works in the same way that the original product would. So it is very important to have the commercial people involved and for them, not only the lawyers, for them to understand the way the contract actually operates and for them to work hand in hand with the lawyers to actually come up with these practical solutions.
Yeah, excellent. Look, I think that is a great little takeaway just in terms of, getting the people who are involved in the actual administration of the contract in those discussions. Not that I wanted to be too cynical about the involvement of lawyers, of course, but they're the types of things that I think our members are hoping to hear. Can we just touch on force majeure, because it is something, as I mentioned before, that you do hear a lot in circumstances where cost escalation takes root. Can either of you give me some examples as to where force majeure in recent times has actually been invoked and been successful, or is it something that's just a bit mythological at this point?
I might start, Alex, only because I have one that's in the forefront of my mind, and it's in the current global environment with the war, or I don't know if we can classify it as that, because when you look at the force majeure clause, obviously typical force majeure clauses account for a circumstance or a force majeure event such as war. And in what we're seeing in recent times is a lot of the people that are relying on the force majeure clause are arguing that, what constitutes a war event, and is it actually war? It's not declared war, so how can you actually rely on that particular clause? So it's very, even though what would seem straightforward and would be pretty clear on the face of it is sometimes not as clear. So yes, I have seen it invoked, have seen it actually successfully work, for example, during the COVID pandemic times, but in more recent times, it could be argued, if there isn't a clear definition, and typically you don't need to define war, but if there are people that may suggest that it's not a declared event, then they might argue against it, and you might not necessarily rely on the clause in the way that it obviously intended to operate.
It's perhaps just worth giving a very brief history lesson also, or legal lesson on force majeure. So the concept is actually a concept known to the civil law countries. So again, just going back one step, you can divide the legal world up into common law countries, which follow the sort of English traditions. So the UK, Australia, America, US, and civil law countries, which are typically the European Union, the Latin America, and others who have a much more codified legal system. And force majeure is a concept that is known to the civil law and gives relief. Perhaps, looking at some of those areas, particularly Latin America, which tend to be a lot more volatile, you can imagine why it might be more important to have a sort of concept of suspension of obligations. In the common law system, including Australia, force majeure doesn't exist as a concept in the common law. It only exists as a matter of contract. So if your contract doesn't include any provisions which deal with force majeure, it's not a remedy or a concept which is available to assist in managing rights. And what we typically end up with in contracts which do include a force majeure provision is a bit of a patchwork between change type provisions, so change in law clauses, force majeure clauses, and potentially other clauses of the contract which deal with a range of external scenarios. And I think the point Natasha was making before and very validly making is what constitutes force majeure will be defined by the contract, and the contract can be very narrow in defining what force majeure is. And a typical definition, at least until recently, involves things like, catastrophic weather events, hurricanes, flooding, biblical scale flooding, ionizing radiations, civil unrest and things of that sort of that nature, and typically don't include things like port closures, closure of key shipping lanes, and the type of events which are affecting suppliers now. We're seeing quite a lot of effort being put into amending force majeure clauses, particularly where they involve international supply, to cover those events which we're seeing now, like closure of key shipping lanes, like freight and logistics unavailability. One recent example, particularly during the COVID pandemic, was the availability of containers to ship materials, and it was actually more of an outbound problem than an inbound problem. But that wasn't something that I'd certainly experienced in nearly 30 years of legal practice prior to the COVID pandemic. So a fair bit of effort's being put into the drafting of the force majeure clauses to include those sort of globally significant events which potentially disrupt supply.
And often, Alex, we see that the force majeure clauses give rise to time, but not necessarily cost entitlement, which still leaves contractors exposed in that respect. I mean, obviously, time entitlement is one thing and protects you from liquidated damages under the contract, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll recover the total loss that you're exposed to as a result. So it's really important that that is clearly linked in the contract.
I'm pretty conscious that we're sort of coming up to the time that we allocated for today, but I've got a couple more questions if you're both open to a little bit more time. Is that all right?
5 minutes.
Just a few minutes. The one that I did want to ask before we start to wrap things up is just around the way that we contract here in Australia. I think a lot of the people within the industry that I talk to who are pretty familiar with contracting practices overseas, have a view that Australia does make life difficult for ourselves in a lot of ways, and I guess probably particularly in the design and construct type of contract model. And Alex, you sort of gave us a good context to begin with, in the sense that going back 25 years or more, things were relatively stable. They've become more volatile, and as we've seen over the last couple of years, it's even more volatile again. Geopolitical instability impacting Western democratic nations is something that we probably haven't had to live with for the better part of half a century or more. And then you've also got uh, you know climate issues becoming more prevalent, depending on what your investment in the concept of climate change is. But I think all of that sort of points to a bit more of a volatile contracting market. If either of you got sort of views just in terms of the way that we approach construction in Australia, and things that you would like to see change.
I think you can add to the list of challenges in the industry is the fact that the supply chains have become much more compressed in terms of the ordering of materials. All tends to be just in time. Fabrication is done just in time. We rely on almost perfect links between components supplied to an overseas manufacturer of the goods, shipping at the time expected, and delivery to the port in Australia. at the time expected and in the location expected. And for those unfamiliar with shipping, it's not uncommon for ships to be diverted or be unable to dock at a particular port because of berth capacity and some other things, and be diverted to another port in Australia. So you expect delivery in Brisbane and you end up with delivery in Melbourne. There tends to be very little remedy for those type of events in the freight contracts, and what you end up with is the cost of, say, road transport from Melbourne to Brisbane, which was unexpected. So the fact that everything is sort of highly dependent and interdependent on each other, I think, increases the risk. You add to that Australia is, by any measure, one of the most sort of robust construction markets anywhere in the world, and you speak to suppliers, contractors, subcontractors that have an international presence. It's pretty well recognised that the contracting market here is extremely robust, and the terms and conditions are particularly onerous. And if you look at the sort of contracting models in other countries, FIDIC contracts, which are commonly used in the Middle East, NEC, or varieties of the NEC contract, which are commonly used in the UK, the fixed price, very hard money, very onerous, no cost escalation type contracts, which are, pretty much the market standard in Australia, are far less prevalent in other places. So, it is a market which definitely carries huge risk. It's probably why construction is consistently right at the top of the league table of industries that have insolvency problems, and in a perfect world, I think a much more benign contracting market would be good for a lot of people in industry, although perhaps less so Natasha and I, because it does keep us very gainfully employed.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Any thoughts on that, Natasha, before we wrap things up today?
No, I don't think I could have said it any better myself. I think Alex captured everything perfectly.
I was hoping you were going to give us a magic wand answer as to how to change that. No magic bullets.
But then we'll be out of a job. We don't want to help you that much. We want to be able to keep us keep our work alive and well.
We might have to edit that last bit out, I think.
So it is worth just adding one thing. The key, I think, to allowing price changes doesn't actually lie with the contractors, particularly those that your members are in contract with. It's much more of a problem for government, financial institutions and others that are providing the money for projects, who have to get their head around the fact that construction is not necessarily a fixed price, stable, static price type industry. It's subject to all sorts of forces, like so many other industries. And if the financial institutions can get their head around that, then that should flow down the line.
Well, that's probably a sensible place to end things, because I think there's multiple avenues for conversation that we could follow, ending on a comment like that. And maybe that's just an opportunity for us to have a part B of this discussion, because I feel like, well, I know for a fact that I've got a whole bunch of other questions that I didn't get to ask today. So look, thank you both very much for agreeing to be part of our first AMCA interview. It's something new for us, and we appreciate you putting your hands up for it. Of course, Alex, you've been such a great supporter of the AMCA and our members over a long period of time, so we thank you for that as well. And with that, we might say goodbye.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks very much, Ben. Great to see you.